Good morning, everyone. Welcome to another episode of The Golden Truth. I'm Dave Kranzler, and with me, as always, is my co-producer, John Titus.
Hey, Dave. How are you? It looks great in Denver.
I'm well, thank you. Beautiful Saturday morning here in Denver. We might be the first day we don't get any rain in about a month. I hope everyone has something fun planned for the weekend. Today we're going to take a break from our derivative series, and on the heels of yesterday's employment report, which I'm sure most of you have had a chance to look at or at least saw the headlines, we wanted to talk about just how misleading and fictitious the headline statistics are, fictitious and misleading the way that it's presented by the financial media, Wall Street, and the politicians. And by now, everyone's pretty much aware of the various fictitious statistical manipulations that the government puts the data they collect through in order to make the numbers look a lot better for political purposes and for economic marketing purposes. It suits Wall Street's purpose of making money to a T. For instance, there's the birth-death model, which lets them plug numbers in there so that they can arrive at a result that looks a lot better than the reality is. There's the unemployment rate, which came in at 6.2% yesterday, and I think by now everyone knows where the data manipulation is there. Yes, the percentage of people working as a percentage of the total labor force may be 6.2%, but how do you define the labor force? And that's something John is going to touch on briefly here. But there's a lot of people who are not part of the labor force who would like to have a job.
Well, that's right, Dave. If you just take the last report from July of 2013 to July of 2014, the number of working age people added to the economy was 2.3 million. Of those people, only 330,000 of them entered the labor force. Now, entering the labor force doesn't necessarily mean you have a job. What it means is that you have a job or you're looking for your job. So in the last 12-month period, only 15% of newly minted working age people entered the labor force. The other 85% aren't working, and they're not looking for work either. And this has been going on for quite some time. July was actually the second best month for 2014. So what's going on is that the economy is certainly and relentlessly adding people to the working age population, but only a tiny fraction of those people are entering the labor force. And this is a long-term problem. It's been going on since the bailouts, and I'm going to drill right down with this video into this very data and show how this economy is in a long-term structural depression. America's real economic health is clear from the government's own labor and population data, which the St. Louis Federal Reserve collects and organizes in its online FRED system. The number of working-age people in the country, called the civilian non-institutional population, has grown steadily since the government started tracking monthly data more than 60 years ago. Since 1953, the working-age population has grown from slightly more than 100 million to just shy of 250 million people, while the labor force has grown from about 60 million to just over 150 million. Most working-age people are actually working or looking for work. This is who makes up the labor force. The percentage of working-age people who are part of the labor force, either because they are working or looking for work, is called the labor force participation rate. Over the last 60 years, the labor force participation rate has averaged 63.2%. It hit a peak of 67.3% in early 2000 and has been in a sustained downtrend ever since. This decline has two distinct segments. The first runs from 2000 through the bailouts in October 2008. The second and far more severe decline, though, has occurred since the bailouts took place and is still ongoing. What's at work here is apparent from the civilian population and labor force curves. Since the bailouts, the number of people added to the working-age population has continued to rise steadily, but the labor force has flattened out. Since October of 2008, the civilian population has grown by 13 million people, but the number of those people who entered the labor force was only 800,000. In other words, for every 16 people who entered their working age years, only one actually makes it into the labor force, either by getting a job or at least looking for one. The other 15 are not in the labor force. In the 5 decades before the bailouts, over 70% of new working-age people entered the labor force. By comparison, the current path to employment is a pipe dream. It gets worse when you look at what's happening to working-age population entrants on a month-to-month basis. There, the structural essence of America's jobs depression is clear. You can see the dynamic at work behind the scenes by zeroing in on the middle of a jobs boom period and comparing it with today. From January of '84 until January of '85, the working-age population grew by 1.85 million people. Not surprisingly, since the general population increases at essentially a constant rate, it grew by the same amount in every year-over-year time frame for each of the next 11 months. The labor force, by contrast, exploded during the same period, in several months actually growing more than the working-age population itself, as people who dropped out of the labor force decided to get off their couches and either get jobs or start looking for jobs. During this one-year period, the overall labor force participation rate rose from 64.7% to 65%. It was pulled up by a year-long streak of months that were all above the historical 63.2% participation rate. When we zoom back out and look at the 60-year labor force participation rate, we can superimpose the underlying month-to-month figures and see very clear patterns just like the ones we saw for 1985. As noted earlier, the 60-year average of the overall labor force participation rate is 63.2%. The 1985 months we zoomed in on were actually part of a multi-year period where the month-to-month participation rate stayed above its long-term average. Extended periods like those pushed the overall labor force participation rate up. There were similar but somewhat shorter sustained boom periods that took place in the 1970s and in the 1960s. Recently, the U.S. has had 2 major busts. The first one happened when the tech bubble burst in the year 2000. The second bust started exactly when the bailouts did. The participation rate has plummeted below the 63.2% average going back to 1953, and it's showing no signs of relenting anytime soon. This untrammeled disaster is the structural jobs depression in the United States. In another video, we'll explain why America will continue bleeding out until revolutionary changes in the country's management are made, one way or another.
Well, John, I find that that's an incredible statistical discovery that you found in the data, and as I mentioned earlier, I haven't seen anyone who's presented the data in that light, and I think it's actually seminal work on the data. I hope everyone found it as informative and stunning as I did. One thing that I would like to point out is that as you see, the actual percentage of the population who is working over time is declining. And many of you have been hearing this nonsense about a housing market recovery. Well, guess what? If people don't have jobs, they're not buying houses. And I am forecasting a serious downleg for the housing market, and I've started to produce some research which shows new home builder stocks, which are insanely overvalued right now. I've got some ideas for making money off of that situation, and I have one report on my website now that talks about a home builder that you can short right now, and I think over the next year or two you can easily make 60% gains. And with that, I hope everybody has a great weekend. John, do you have anything to add?
No, we'll follow up this video, though, with another one explaining exactly why this dynamic is going to be very long-term unless serious changes are made. That's it.
John, I look forward to that. Until the next time, that was the golden truth.